Hi there. I'm Matthew Herzberg. This is the Myopia Mindset, and I'm here to say thank you. Thank you to our paid supporters who have invested in us their real life, actual money because they believe in what we're doing. They see value in the Myopia Mindset, and they believe in our mission to inspire, educate, and motivate the next gen of myopia management doctors. I'm blown away by the absolute positive reaction to the podcast and the support. And this episode that I have for this week is a preview to what the paid supporters are getting each and every month. This episode, this preview, is an interview with Dr. Cary Herzberg. He's a pioneer of myopia management. He has mentored and inspired countless others who have gone on to be successful with orthokeratology and myopia management. And it all begins with his mindset, his personality, his passion, the way he looks at things. And that is what this episode is all about. Here's a preview to that. Our paid supporters, in addition to getting a bonus monthly episode, also get an extended version of every episode as our way of saying thank you. So consider becoming a paid supporter. Myopiamindset.substack.com is how you do that. Thank you again, paid supporters. Blown away. I can't believe it. I appreciate it so much. Let's get to the episode. All right, welcome to the Myopia Mindset. And if you're listening to this, then you are listening to, I don't know what we're going to call it, like our subscriber series or our patron series or supporter series. The point is, if you're listening to this episode, this is part of my weekly discussions with my dad, Dr. Cary Herzberg. And this is for supporters of the Myopia Mindset who believe in what we're doing. And I have the benefit of, being the son of one of the greatest legends in myopia management and Ortho-K. And he and we talk every single week about this stuff. We love it. And I was like, hey, Cary, let's turn on the mics and record these discussions. And let's have this be like a weekly shot in the arm for our listeners who support us. Your weekly motivation will also deliver perspective, educational content. And that is the whole point of these extra episodes of the Myopia Mindset. So, Cary Herzberg, welcome to the program.
No, thanks, Matt. It's great to be here.
Yeah. And if you don't know who Cary Herzberg is, he's been in practice for over 50 years. And 40 of those years, he's been doing myopia management and Ortho-K. He's one of the founders of the American Academy of Orthokeratology and Myopia Control, and its founding president. He's a past president of the international group and a core part of the process that formed the international myopia management and Ortho-K community. He is responsible for directly and indirectly influencing so many people in our industry. There's many super successful orthokeratologists who cite Cary Herzberg as being not just an inspiration, but having a direct role in their path to success and their development of their myopia mindset. So I figured the best way for us to start our special weekly conversations is let's delve deep into what Cary Herzberg's myopia mindset is. Because, Cary, wouldn't you agree that the myopia mindset is unique to a certain set of doctors in our industry?
Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, it's not universal by any means, but and that's some of the specialness about it. I guess it's been we've been like lone people out there forever.
Yeah,
as far as calling to our colleagues to start picking up on this myopia thing. I mean, you talk about the very beginnings of this thing back in the early 80s. There was nobody talking about this. So, that's I guess where this all begins, where this discussion really starts, is the inception of what this, in my unique experience, what this meant for me.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I would also add that the myopia mindset is almost as unique to each of you as it is a fingerprint to each individual. Like there are definitely commonalities in the myopia mindset of docs who are successful at ortho-K and myopia management. But the most interesting thing to me is that each one of those doctors has a unique flavor or flair or experience that has helped shape their unique myopia mindset. It isn't just like, hey, follow these sets of rules, everybody does it the same, you come out with the
Right.
same conclusions. You'll meet myopia experts and ortho-K doctors who you'd be like, I don't know how this person, succeeds with this particular aspect of their practice, but they do. And that's one of the greatest things about our community is a lot of these docs are very open and willing to share it. And I'm hoping for that to be kind of the theme of our podcast moving forward is to expose our audience to those docs, what makes it work, how they started out, what kind of mistakes they made, what kind of key successes were those game-changing moments for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I'd like to do with this interview essentially is let's start out at the beginning. How did you find out about ortho-K and myopia management? What did your practice look like back then?
Yeah. My dad was an optometrist, so was my grandfather, and they were. It wasn't a GP lens that it was a PMMA lens. It didn't breathe oxygen at all. It was a very the material, these plastics that were used in like airplane windshield in World War II. So they were fitting those lenses. That was the contact lens industry. In fact, I later became the president of the National Eye Research Foundation. It was Newton Wesley who founded that group that actually had the patent on the original corneal contact lens. Prior to that, there were sclerals, which were large lenses. In the 1800s, they were made of glass. So they were the lenses fit over the entire limbus area of the eye onto the sclera. And so, but the corneal lens became unique and with Tui and Newton's patent. So my dad was, as was that era, they were very skilled at fitting these PMA lenses, which is really something because no oxygen permeability. So, these things go way back enough that we remember the fact that some of us used to see these old PMA wearers, the lenses would last 25, 30 years, and the lenses we'd often joke the lenses would look great, but the corneas look like trash. It's like they didn't look good at all. You had to rehab a cornea after they wore these lenses. So that was a unique experience with that. But anyway, that was where I was cut my teeth, in contact lenses. We all, in school, we had to put our sets together, make a set of lenses to fit on the patient's eyeball. And one of the unique characteristics of the PMA lens was the fact that it flattened over time. We didn't know this in the beginning, but it actually flattened. So when you put a patient and you fit them in a certain base curve, that base curve would flatten maybe a half to 3/4 of a diopter before the patient stopped using the lens. So the patient would take the lens off and you'd see, minus 150 was now minus 75 or minus a half. So the question became, can I do this on purpose? Because patients loved it. They would say that I took my lenses off at the end of the day and I could still drive and things like that. I could still see well. Can you do this for me, permanently, make that happen? So that's really where ortho-K began. And Stu Grant, actually, in the early 1960s, was a fellow who first sat down and really looked at this. So that's where we saw the beginnings of that. And I also noticed through time that my PMA wearers were just doing better. The soft lenses came out in the early 1970s, the Czechoslovakian patent, the Bausch and Lomb lens. And those patients then started wearing soft lenses in the 70s and then into the 80s. And I would notice that my rigid lens wearers would be doing better physically. They'd be seeing better, over time than my soft lens wearers. And so it became a point about discovering why, what was happening, what was the unique process that was causing this unique change in the eye that these patients were thriving better. Just doing better. I grew up, in optometry, cutting my teeth in the preventive care model, and so Hippocratic oath says do no harm. So it was alien to me to watch patients' vision deteriorate over time, to see a patient continually progress in myopia, and when we're talking about this, we're talking about the early '80s. This was a unique time. This was a time when we first began noticing several things happening with our patients and the population. One was the fact that they were we had an increase in obesity. The other thing was that at the same time, diabetes was stepping up, increasing in incidence, and we had myopia. All three of these things were going, and throughout the 80s, no one really had the guts really to come out and call this as it was, because they were afraid they'd be wrong. But maybe just a trend they were just looking at one misleading side of it. And it wasn't until the 90s that they actually came and started discovering that what was happening was that there was a whole big change in the workplace, with the IBM work desktops that come out in the early 80s, and our patients were having different, the different ways that they handle their job at work. The interesting thing about this also, at the same time, and all these ingredients came together, was the fact that when a patient got through college, we generally didn't see them again until they got to be in their 40s, when they needed reading glasses. In other words, their prescription stayed really stable. We had to encourage them to come and let's check your, the retina and make sure it's healthy. But the patients weren't coming in that often because they didn't have changes in prescription. After the near point college work was done, their eyes were pretty stable, and it wasn't until they started losing the close work in their 40s that we'd actually start seeing them again. Well, what was happening in the 80s that I was noticing was that my patients were suddenly coming in every 6 months for evaluations, which was really something. This was like a sea change. This is something that you'd have to really kind of wonder what's going on here. Why are these patients coming in, more often for checkups? And so all those things were going on at that point. And, for me, it was again, a mindset that I was not going to practice the conventional wisdom at the time, which was to just encourage more myopia for my patients by just refitting them into higher and higher prescriptions. I was going to find some other way of doing this. And so Ortho-K was the point where I sunk my teeth into. That was the thing that I could see, happening here. We had developed this PMA lens, and now we were working on doing this on purpose with the OK lenses. The OK3 come out, and we were going to do this on purpose. So I could see that as being an avenue, forward on this.
Yeah. Let me ask you this question too, because I found it very interesting when you said that, these trends were increasing. And we know these trends to be trends that are a sedentary lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
Being in 2024 and being able to look back at the 1980s, now the data shows, like you mentioned, with the advent of the personal computer and then later the internet and so on and so forth, human beings, especially Americans, start becoming more sedentary,
mm-hmm.
And start doing work that's more in front of computers and close work and whatnot. But I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that the trends were there, but they weren't, like, there wasn't the kind of attention that we needed to put on them back then. And I think that there's a parallel to today, because I don't know if I ever told you this, but on my path I love my general practitioner, my doctor, because she it's no BS with her. She answers all my questions. She takes her time with me. I love it. I fired a doctor essentially once in the past because I was clearly overweight and the doctor did not mention it, and I'm not saying I was ballooning out and it was getting to like dangerous levels, but like it was clear that was happening. Like I had taken on a bunch of weight. And I have heard this over and over again, that even general practitioner doctors aren't bringing this up to their patients. There's a stigma around that. And I think that if that was the case in the 1980s, where I think people have these rose tinted glasses about how, like, back then, these things were being brought up and addressed better. But it sounds like there's kind of a parallel between then and now, where we're still not talking about these essential things that have led to these problems.
Well, our colleagues were getting angry at us because myopia was the cash cow. What do you mean? Eliminating myopia, reducing myopia. This is how they made their living, because that was the big engine that drove people into your practice. Being nearsighted, farsighted patients could deal until they got older, unless the prescriptions were higher. So this was the cash cow, and our colleagues were looking at us like, "What are you talking about here? This is how we make our living." So you're attacking this, this fact. Yes, I had the same. I've done the same thing. We're so similar in that respect. I've fired many physicians because they didn't sit down with me and explain exactly what was happening. And we, in this, I always felt part of my mindset here with myopia was that I would, part of what I do is educate the patients. I want the patient to know as much as I know about a subject, if I can. So when we switched from axial, we switched into axial length, we suddenly went from diopters. And I tried to explain to them why my patients need to think about microns. And this took a while to do this, to think on the level of microns. And I would explore with my patients the fact that, the younger patients that, how thousands of a millimeter, how small that is, they think about it. This is what we're measuring with our, with our devices here. And so, so this, again, the due attention to this process, it's the old saw about doing unto others as you want done unto yourself kind of a thing. I always approached it that respect. I wanted physicians like myself to educate me on the same way that I educate my patients. And so it always, I couldn't go in with rose-colored glasses and say, this is fine. And I've had many patients not many, but I've had some patients walk out the door with me when I've told them that they need to lose weight. Plainly. And I've had other patients who have sat in the chair and stayed with me and said, I didn't realize that was related to diabetes, being obese. Right.
Yeah. And that's kind of my point, though, is I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think that is kind of the origin of the myopia mindset, is that you are not going to let these things stand anymore. You are going to be that advocate for the patient and their parent, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later in this conversation. But I want to point that out as a key feature that I have noticed in many of the doctors and myopia coordinators that I've worked with over the last 20 years, where it's like, like Paul Levine, past president of the AAOMC. He's got his own origin story. Is basically a part of it is like, I kept looking at this problem. I kept noticing that it was happening, and I felt like I was powerless to do anything about it. So I began looking for a solution to do something about it. And I think that that is kind of the core structure of the myopia mindset, is that like you as a healthcare provider who's taking care of patients are seeing a problem, and you are not going to keep it to yourself. You are not going to underplay that problem. You are going to make sure that for whatever it takes, your patients and their parents are going to be aware of what you're doing and and why you're concerned about this.
There's an interesting thing that at the same time that was going on as we're talking here, and it was on our institutions of optometry, the research that was being done. Most of that was the conventional dialogue at the time was the fact that this was all genetics, right? That you're nearsighted because of genetics. And that's kind of like a get out of jail free card for for us, because it says it's not your responsibility. It's going to be genetics. So what? And this was we as clinicians knew this wasn't true, but this was something promoted from the top tiers of education, from our top people. I won't name names, but all those people who are talking that way now are now reverse themselves, are now on the other side of it. But it wasn't then. We as clinicians had to argue about this because we were seeing in our practice patients that were exhibiting myopia that didn't have any parental history and started at a very young age and developed very high prescriptions very quickly. And this is definitely not genetics. This was something else entirely. So we knew we were dealing with a different animal here. But the frustrating part was that we were not hearing that. It wasn't reinforced. It took a decade or more to get that to change.
Right.
And so here we were out in this environment, using a system at the time, Ortho-K, for that alone. Now you've got many other ways you can do this. And being criticized by our colleagues because what are you doing to these corneas? This is you can't do this, or you're causing. They would say you're causing spherical aberration. This is terrible. How could you do this on purpose? Well, it turned out that spherical aberration was the key factor in controlling myopia. But if we hadn't persisted through that, there were about 100 of us in this group, hadn't persisted in making this happen, you wouldn't have had this. You might have been somewhere today, but not nearly at the point we are. We created a lot of stir in our industry. We created a lot of change, and the reason why you had an FDA the FDA approval was partly for the reasons that at NERF that we encouraged that to have happen. Yeah, it had to be done. In fact, we can go into that at some point. So I always felt going through this process
All right, that's it for this brief preview to a supporter exclusive episode. And I know you're interested in seeing at least a little bit more because you've made it this far. So please consider becoming a full supporter of the Myopia Mindset for basically the cost of a cup of coffee every single week, $12 a month. You get the full bonus episode of the podcast every month. You get all of the extended versions of the regular episodes, and you support my mission to inspire, educate, and motivate more docs to do myopia management and do it at the top of their game. So if you would buy me a cup of coffee each and every week just to talk about myopia, please consider becoming a paid supporter of the Myopia Mindset. Thank you so much, and I'll see you at the next one.